Today, we're asking a very simple question on the podcast. Is this player trending or ending going into the 2024 season? We will debate 8 different players and whether we think their stock will continue to rise or if their stock is going to fall as we get into the 2024 season. Welcome, man. Lucas Wencl, Tyler Plath, again with you on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Cameron's excuse today is his Wi-Fi isn't working. At this point, I'm just convinced he doesn't want to join the podcast anymore. And if that's the case, Cameron, we accept your 2 weeks notice.
I bet he doesn't even have a house at this point. I think it's just all made up. He's actually still in Florida, and he just wants us to think that he's in Minnesota again.
I went over and scraped popcorn ceiling at some random person's house, and his wife just happened to be there, just put on the performance of a lifetime pretending it was their house. Like, at this point, it might all just be a lie. And I wouldn't be surprised. Of course, we have to razz Cameron at the start of every episode. I'm just waiting for the days when I'm going to be gone for, 2-3 episodes in a row and be like, guys, I'm so sorry. And then Cameron just opens up with bop, bop, bop for me every single episode. And frankly, I deserve it at this point. Look, we're a little bit off topic. Trending or ending. 8 different players who either were trending in the right direction at the end of last season or were even trending in a negative direction. Can they turn things around? Can they keep up the pace that they were on at the end of last season? Again, we will be discussing 8 players in this episode, so it's a lot to cover, Ty. Let's dive on in. So we're going to talk about a handful of different running backs, a handful of wide receivers, some big names as well in this episode. A lot of guys who will be going early in your fantasy football drafts this year. So Ty, let's go ahead and start with Kyren Williams, running back for the Los Angeles Rams. Last year, 228 attempts for 1,144 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns, added 206 yards through the air with 3 touchdowns as well. Look, the big case for Kyren Williams is that he was the running back 2 in fantasy points per game last year. And McVay has this history, right, with running backs that he trusts. We saw it with Todd Gurley. It never really came to fruition with Cam Akers. But now it seems like it's happening again with Kyren Williams. But the case for Kyren Williams potentially ending going into this year is that the Rams drafted Blake Corum in the 3rd round. They spent some valuable capital on him. There's obviously some injury issues and concerns, but really I think the big thing that's going to be scaring people off this year is that Sean McVay has been calling Blake Corum basically Kyren Williams. They basically have 2 of him now, and that could scare some people off considering, maybe they don't want to give Kyren Williams, 20 plus touches a game next year. What say you? Is Kyren Williams trending or ending going into 2024?
I personally think that Kyren Williams is trending, and that seems to be kind of the opposite as of I will say June 12th at 8:06 Central Time, just because everyone doesn't really know the status of his injury. No one really knows, again, how severe the injury was that held him out of OTAs. And then you add in the Blake Corum aspect to things. And again, like the guy was taken in the 3rd round of the draft, right? That's not just, that's not draft capital that you just shrug off and just say like, that's not a big deal. Like 3rd round capital for a running back is a pretty big deal. But the reason why I say that Kyren is trending is, again, the history of McVay relying on one guy. And I would be more concerned in some ways if Blake Corum was kind of the opposite of Kyren Williams in the sense that he's maybe more of a receiving threat. Maybe he's a bit bigger, maybe, picture like an AJ Dillon, a Todd Gurley even, right? Someone that may steal like goal line touches from him. I don't really see that happening, at least in year 1. So if Kyren comes back healthy and in training camps, reports are saying, he's all good. There's no rust that he's shaking off or anything. I really don't think that there's any reason to doubt Kyren as the undoubted one in that offense.
So when Kyren came back from injury last year, can I read you, the amount of touches he had in those games? This is basically from week 12 on. 22 touches, 24 touches, 28 touches, 32 touches, 22 touches, 22 touches. I mean, this is a guy who was averaging basically 23 touches per game to close out last season. And if you're hoping he stays healthy, because he did miss what was it, 4 games in the middle of the season last year. If you want him to stay healthy, this is like the Derrick Henry argument, right? Like, you can't keep giving this guy 25 touches a game if you want to keep his longevity in your offense. Now, Sean McVay isn't afraid to cut bait. So I think there is something to what you're saying of, use him till you lose him, right? Like, just burn all the tread on him until you can't drive him anymore. But I do think there is something to them about drafting Blake Corum. I agree. I don't think Blake Corum is going to be this monster threat, right? Like, I feel like he's like, it's not the exact same as Zach Charbonnet to Ken Walker, but in the same way that people were freaked out about Zach Charbonnet to Ken Walker last year, I feel like people are kind of using the same thing with Blake Corum to Kyren Williams, right? Where it's like Charbonnet could come in and steal, some of the early down work and some of the third down work as well. I think this is different. I can't pin a trending or ending on Kyren because he's going as the running back 8 right now. So that would indicate to me that he is ending, or he's going as the running back 7, excuse me. Devon Achane is going as the running back 8. So to me, that indicates that he is more ending than trending, but I don't think he's ending to this point that he's going to finish outside of the top 12 running backs this year. If I were to say he's trending, I would have to say he is firmly planting himself in the top, I'll say 3 running backs again this year, right? Ahead of one of Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and Bijan Robinson. I don't think that happens. Therefore, I am going to lean towards ending, but it is like ending light. It's like the Busch Lights of ending, right? It's just like, it's not like it's a beer, but it's like the cheapest beer that you can buy, and it's not the highest of quality. So I think it's like an ending light, where I don't think he necessarily repeats, as a running back 2 in fantasy points per game last year, but I do think he is, still probably going to be paying off a running back 7 ADP.
I think, yeah, that's the best way to put it. It's not that, like, for where he goes in drafts right now, I don't want to say it's the perfect spot, but where he goes makes a ton of sense, right? With all the question marks that people have, while also realizing the possibility that he can be he's going to see a ton of touches in this offense, right? Like, that running back 8 spot, it pretty much reflects all of that. And if you think that Kyren is, again, going to be the guy that maybe Blake Corum won't have as big of a role, let's say early on in the season, then you certainly are investing in that running back 8 spot. But if you think Blake Corum takes a huge chunk out of his workload, then I can absolutely see you kind of fading and saying that he's an ending kind of player, just because, again, the workload that he was on last year was something special, and having that taken away certainly hurts his outlook.
Let's move on to a guy who I think you and I would agree Kyren was definitely trending at the end of last season. This is a guy who was definitely ending at the end of last season. That is Stefon Diggs, wide receiver for now the Houston Texans, coming off of a season, 160 targets, caught 107 of them for just under 1,200 yards and still scored 8 times. So not a terrible line for Stefon Diggs. Definitely not his best. Look, the big case for Stefon Diggs to have a bounce back this year, for him to be trending going into this year, is that he was traded to the Houston Texans, right? A high-powered offense. He's a potential wide receiver 1 in this offense and the potential top target getter as well. That's the big case for him being trending. But man, the ending still feels like a relatively strong case as well, because he had a miserable, like disastrous end to 2023. The dude was the wide receiver 42. A guy you took in the first round last year, a guy who was a top 3 wide receiver through the first half of the season, but a terrible end, the wide receiver 42 over the second half of the season. And he's competing with 2 guys who flourished in this offense last year. You still got Nico Collins there, who just got paid. You still got Tank Dell, who looked like a future stud on the field last year. And really, over the last 5 years, Diggs hit his low in yards per route run. He's kind of bottomed out at yards per route run, which is a metric we typically like to look at in terms of predicting future success for wide receiver. So when we see that, declining, it's not the end of the world, but it's definitely not something that gives us optimism going into the next year. So what say you about Stefon Diggs in his new situation? Will this be a trending? Will he continue to trend downward this year? Or will that be ending and he actually takes a swing upward in this Houston Texans offense?
I'm torn. I'm really, really torn. Because when you have to acknowledge the talent that is Stefon Diggs, and you have to say, okay, a player of his caliber does not just fall off and continue to decline and fall off with his kind of talent and all that stuff. So like I struggle in saying that like the end of last year is the trend and that's going to continue, especially going into this offense in Houston that likes to throw the ball, right? And I will say, I guess I lean towards that last year's trend is going to end, because I do think that Diggs can be the lead target getter in this offense. Now, that does not necessarily mean that he's going to be the highest scoring wide receiver in this
Right.
offense or that he's going to be the big play guy, but like it would not surprise me if Diggs has a very similar season, maybe not in terms of like exact numbers, but if he becomes like the Michael Pittman Jr. of this Houston offense, if he becomes the Chris Olave of this offense, where he is just going to get peppered with targets, he's going to, again, be by and far the lead target getter, but it may not exactly turn out to be, the old Stefon Diggs that we've remembered for the past 3-4 years, right? So right now in drafts, he currently goes as a wide receiver 20, I
20.
think.
Nico goes as a wide receiver 14 for comparison.
I'm A-okay with Diggs as the wide receiver 20.
Yes.
And, he keeps falling in drafts, and every single time I get the chance to stop the slide, I do, because I'm just like, again, the role for this guy, for how talented he is, there's no way that last year's trend continues. I just can't see a way where that happens.
People keep saying, look at the contract Nico got. He's the wide receiver 1, man. He's the wide receiver 1. And I say, you can look at the bare bones of the Stefon Diggs trade and say, well, they only gave up, a second to go get him, second and some other picks. But do we realize that Houston traded out of their first round pick to get that second round pick to trade for Stefon Diggs? Like the Texans traded out of their first round pick. That does not mean nothing. That has to mean something in this equation. So for me, Stefon Diggs is still the one on this team. I think Nico Collins can play a great 2, and I think they can actually play complementary to one another. I think a lot of people are thinking, well, Nico's going to take away from Diggs and Diggs is going to take away from Nico. Like, while that's true, I don't think it's this drastic, like they're going to just be butting heads in the exact same role. I think they can be complementary to one another, and Tank can play on the inside really well with these guys. I do think the trend of Diggs declining in his career does end this year. I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1 in Houston. You don't trade for a guy of his caliber to come in and say, "Hey, play behind Nico Collins." How do you think the diva that Stefon Diggs is? And like, no disrespect to Diggs, I actually think it's funny when he plays a diva. I actually think it's super comical. And comical in a good way. How are you going to bring in a diva like him and say play second fiddle to the guy who's only had one good season compared to your well-represented resume throughout your career? So I think we do get a trending season upwards from Stefon Diggs. I do think he bucks that trend of declining last year and finds himself in a really, really nice situation in Houston. Now, it's not going to be a trending, to top 12 status. I don't think that's going to happen. But do I think he finishes ahead of Nico Collins? I do. I definitely think he finishes ahead of Tank Dell. I frankly would flip Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs in ADP. I would rather draft Stefon Diggs as the wide receiver 14 and Nico Collins as the wide receiver 20. So I do think we see Stefon Diggs buck that ending trend and see him start to trend upwards going into this year.
I also get a lot of people will look at what Nico Collins did last year and again be completely fascinated by it in year 2 with CJ Stroud and Bobby Slowick's offense and stuff like that. But I think people need to be reminded of just how, I don't want to use the word efficient. I don't want to use the word outlier. But this Houston offense kind of overachieved last year, and you can kind of see it. And I'm using this stat, and I joked about this earlier with you, Lucas. I'm going to be the expected fantasy points guy all off season long. Okay. But Nico Collins was 4th in fantasy points over expected, was 4th, nearly 50 points more than expected. Tank Dell 16th with 24 points over expected. Like I think we are kind of, I don't want to say we're overbuying how good this Houston offense was last year, but I think a lot of people are kind of expecting Nico and Tank to remain at the same level as they were last year. And that just does not happen when you bring in a guy like Stefon Diggs.
Speaking of a guy who may or may not stay at the same pace that he was last year, I think this is a perfect transition into talking about Brandon Aiyuk, who last year really had a career season, 75 receptions, only 105 targets, but went for over 1,300 yards and caught 7 touchdowns. He was averaging 17.9 yards per reception last year. That is an absurd number. That is an absolutely absurd number. You look at the other guys, who were in the top 12 last year. I mean, you get CeeDee Lamb at 13, obviously Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill was only at 15. You would think Tyreek Hill would be averaging, higher than 15. Mike Evans was at 15.9. Nico Collins 16.2. Then you got Brandon Aiyuk at 17.9 as the wide receiver 14 in PPR formats last year. So I think that's a case to him ending this year, is that we are going to see regression. He is a very, very likely regression candidate. He was the wide receiver 36 to use your stat, Ty, in expected fantasy points per game. That is for those of you who don't do math in the summertime, a 22 wide receiver difference compared to where he finished last year. Now, on the other hand, probably established himself as the wide receiver 1 ahead of Deebo Samuel in what is going to continue being a high-scoring offense. Brandon Aiyuk getting into his 4th year in the league now. He had his breakout season. He might be here to stay. But what say you, Ty? He's currently going as the wide receiver 12 on Underdog Fantasy right now. Will Brandon Aiyuk continue trending going into 2023 or 2024, or will he be ending?
Ending, guys. Like this is like obvious of all obvious regression candidates that we, again, 18 yards per reception is outrageous. And I wish I had like the historical data kind of in front of me that I had run over on the RotoViz screener. I'm going to plug them. It's a phenomenal tool, right? You can look back in the last like 20 years of football and go, okay, you can measure targets and yards and all these different kinds of metrics. It's a fun tool. But his career average before last year in yards per reception was like 13.4. And again, if you take that and put it with his volume last year, it's the wide receiver 25. Like this offense, I don't want to say they are built on big plays, but they really are. Like because they are so big play focused. I shouldn't say focused. They get so many big plays, I should say, that they don't need to be hyper targeted or hyper, they don't need a whole lot of plays to put up points and to get a ton of yards. That's why we see Deebo and Brandon Aiyuk and even George Kittle last year too have super, super efficient years in terms of just the amount of touches, but then with the yards that they got to. This offense is good, but what we do know is that this offense goes through Christian McCaffrey first. Everything else kind of falls second fiddle to Christian McCaffrey. So if there is a Niners player, it's Christian McCaffrey that you want. Everyone knows that. He's the first pick in drafts this year again. Well worth it. Don't fall for the trap, though, of Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel in your second round of best ball drafts. Wide receivers that are kind of going right around them, like Brandon Aiyuk, wide receiver 12, you said.
Yep.
It's tough because then you're looking at like Devontae Adams and Nico Collins and then Deebo himself, and you're like, man, that sucks. Like, give me Saquon Barkley out of all four of those guys.
I think Jalen Waddle there instead.
Yeah, you can make that
Waddle
argument.
here.
I would take
the inverse of Aiyuk this year. I think you had a regression season from Jalen Waddle last year, and I think that regression season was almost how do I want to phrase it? It was a steeper regression than anticipated. And I don't think that's the new norm for Jalen Waddle. I actually think he bounces back really nicely this year versus Aiyuk. Massive amount of improvement, massive efficiency this last year, and I think his regression will be pretty steep this year as well. It's almost the inverse of the two, where I expect Jalen Waddle after a regression season to bounce back pretty nicely, but in Jalen Waddle, let's not in 2022, holy crap, was he hyper efficient, and then he took a fall last year. Brandon Aiyuk, hyper efficient last year. My guess is that he does take a tumble this year as well. I side with you, but finish your thought.
Yeah, if you are okay with where Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel go in drafts this year, you are saying that you think that this offense can repeat the hyper efficiency that every player was on last year, including the guy that we're going to talk about next. But you think that this offense can continue the trend, I should say, of how they played last year. I get it because it's a high scoring offense, but it screams regression. That's the only way I can say it.
Yeah, I'm with you. There is massive regression coming for Brandon Aiyuk this year. And it is nothing against the player. I actually really like the player of Brandon Aiyuk. I thoroughly enjoyed his rookie season. Then he got put in the doghouse, obviously, by Sean McVay. But I want to go back to that Jalen Waddle point that I brought up because I think he is like the prime example of this, right? In 2021 rookie season, right, 104 receptions on 140 targets. Yeah, barely 1,000 yards, only 9.8 yards per reception. But then, holy crap, in 2022, 75 for 1,356 on 117 targets, 18.1 yards per reception. That's almost identical to the season that Brandon Aiyuk just had. 8 less targets, but both put up over 1,300 yards on hyper efficient seasons. 8 touchdowns for Waddle, 7 for Aiyuk. But then this last year, right? Only 14 games for Waddle, but 104 targets, just over 1,000 yards, average 14.1 yards per reception, and only 4 touchdowns. Like, there is the regression that came for Jalen Waddle. And again, a little bit steeper than what we expected, considering he was in Mike McDaniel's offense. But the regression decline might not be as steep for Brandon Aiyuk, but it is definitely coming. And I think what you're betting on for him at the wide receiver 12 is that he repeats last year, because that's what he needs to do. Like, he finished as the wide receiver 14 despite those numbers. Like, he has to get better this year. He has to average more yards. He either has to get more targets and keep averaging 17.9 yards per reception. He either has to score double-digit touchdowns despite a decline in efficiency, or he has there's so many things that have to go right again for Aiyuk this year, and I just don't know if that's going to happen. This offense is going to regress. It is just the normal. And I'll use an example of the next guy we're going to talk about, because we need to talk about his quarterback, Brock Purdy, as well, who, I mean, can I just say it for the people? We both think he's going to be ending this year as well. He will not continue trending going into 2024.
Yes.
So the example I'm going to use is Aaron Rodgers. I think Aaron Rodgers explains the regression model for this perfectly. In 2020, Aaron Rodgers was the quarterback 3. He had a 70.7 completion percentage. He threw for nearly 4,300 yards, and his touchdown to interception ratio was absolutely insane. He threw 48 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. Now, do not think that I am calling Brock Purdy Aaron Rodgers. If you have listened to this show at all, you know I do not think that. I think the two are eons apart from one another. But I'm using this as an example that even for the greats, we see this regression, and Brock Purdy isn't on the same level. But in 2020, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback 3, 48 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. You look at 2021 then. Aaron Rodgers regresses to a 69 completion percentage. Very nice 69 completion percentage. Just over 4,100 yards. Still a 37 to 4 touchdown to interception ratio there. Finishes as the quarterback 6. So he regressed slightly, but that was still against the odds, right? The fact that he threw for 37 touchdowns a year after throwing 48, which is a massive, massive outlier, is still unheard of. And then you get to 2022. Floor fell out. 64.6 completion percentage. Not even 3,700 yards. 26 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. The floor fell out for Aaron Rodgers, right? Now I understand there was all sorts of changes there, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. That was the first season Devontae Adams left the Green Bay Packers. And I understand there's changes there. And there's not as many changes happening to the 49ers. And there might be, though. Brandon Aiyuk or Deebo Samuel might not be there next year. But this regression curve always comes, even for the great ones. You can look at Patrick Mahomes after in 2022 threw 41 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. And then last year, what did Patrick Mahomes do? 27 and 14. Not even 4,200 yards, but in 2022, he threw for 5,200 yards. The regression curve always comes for these players. It is inevitable. I will scream it from the rooftops. I've been rambling long enough, Ty, but is there anything you want to top this cake with?
I was just watching a Marvel movie the other day. I was watching some Doctor Strange.
Which one?
The
Multiverse
first
of Madness? Okay, good.
No,
the better
first
one.
one. The better one.
Better one.
And Mordo has this line that he says at least like 3 times at the end of the movie. The bill comes due. We're going to see it. Even if it doesn't happen this year, then I'm not a betting man, but I would put life savings down that the year after is the year that we would see the regression actually hit. Because again, the clip at how this team was operating at is ridiculously hard to repeat year after year.
We'll end it there. We don't need to berate the point any longer. Let's take a quick break, Ty. We'll be back with 4 more players who will discuss if they are trending or ending going into the 2024 season. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We are going to continue. That one was a little bit less impressive for you this time around. We just weren't in sync this time.
It's weird because I hear you say it and then I do it, but the video says I'm late. So it's like, who's actually right? You or me?
Cameron's the wrong one. We'll keep plugging through because he's not here. Gosh, I gotta quit throwing jabs at him. We'll keep plowing through our 3 trending or 4, trending or ending players, and let's move on to a guy who, like Stefon Diggs, finds himself in a new home this season. Josh Jacobs, running back for the Green Bay Packers. Last season, bit of a down year, big regression candidate after his phenomenal 2022 season. Didn't play all 17 games, but 233 attempts, 805 yards, 6 touchdowns. That is gross. That's less than 4 yards carry for Josh Jacobs. What is that? 3.6. Still caught 37 passes though, and 54 targets for 296 yards. The big reason why he could be bucking his downward trend in 2024 is this sneaky receiving production, right? Aaron Jones is no longer in town in Green Bay. Josh Jacobs could fill that void very nicely. We've seen him do it plenty of times in back-to-back seasons in Vegas. And he's a bigger back for touchdowns as well in an up-and-coming offense, right? This Green Bay offense is an exciting one. They're going to be in scoring position often, which could lead to more goal line touches for Josh Jacobs. Problem is, though, the Green Bay offense has always deployed a 2 running back system. Matt LaFleur has been persistent in that. And over the last 3 seasons, this team has only totaled 23 rushing touchdowns. That is for if you want, again, for those of you who don't do math during the summer, that is that is less than 8 per season. AJ Dillon is the only running back to even touch 7 over the last 3 years. Both have fallen well short of that in 2021 and 2023. So Ty, with Josh Jacobs in a new home, in a better offense in Green Bay, will he buck his ending trend in 2024, or will he continue trending downwards?
Josh Jacobs kind of is like right down the middle for me because you can't help you have to acknowledge that going from Vegas to Green Bay is an improvement in just offensive quality and offensive efficiency, right? The problem is, again, kind of like what you had said, though, this Green Bay offense does not normally rely on just one back. Now, I will say this, though, too. Aaron Jones, Josh Jacobs are 2 pretty different backs, right? They are different size. One is bigger, one is faster, one is more agile, one is more power, more downhill. So in some ways, there is a small possibility, a small chance that Josh Jacobs does kind of change the narrative that comes with Green Bay Packer running backs. That being said, though, I can't go against what history has told us about this Green Bay offense. And there has been a bigger running back in Green Bay the last 3 seasons by the name of AJ Dillon. Now, that gets into the debate of like, well, is AJ Dillon like a quality running back? Does he deserve, or did he deserve as many touches or the usage that he got in Green Bay with Aaron Jones and all that kind of stuff? But I really think that like this offense just is not like they use the run game to set up the pass game, but they get real creative in the red zone when it comes to the passing game. They don't rely on the run game like they used to. I mean, it was what, 2019 when Aaron Jones finishes a running back 1 overall, running back 2 overall, because he had like 15 touchdowns or something like that. Like, again, he splits it right down the middle because, again, he is a much different running back than we have seen in Green Bay. But the offensive historical data just says otherwise, that Josh Jacobs, this backfield will not completely be his, or at least be his in the way that we want it to be, where he is getting most of the 3 down work in this offense. So I guess if anything, I know that he finished last year with an injury, so like to say that like he's going to continue the ending trend, like he was hurt. I don't want to say that he's going to continue to be hurt, but I'll just say it like this. Josh Jacobs is a very easy not fade. I just would rather look elsewhere when he's towards the top of my draft board, because there are other running backs that go right around him that I prefer, like Isaiah Pacheco and James Cook.
Yep.
it just doesn't excite me. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
So just to fact check you on Aaron Jones, running back 2 in 2019, 16 rushing touchdowns, still scored. You ready for this? 160 less points than Christian McCaffrey that year.
Oh my word. Oh.
So not quite the running back one. He was a running back 2 though, but 160 less PPR points than Christian McCaffrey, despite scoring 16 rushing touchdowns. Here's what I'll say about Josh Jacobs. This is not an ADP debate episode. This is an episode about, do we think this player will continue trending in the direction they were at the end of last season, or will they be ending that trend, whether it is bouncing back or continuing to trend downward? I don't think it gets worse for Josh Jacobs after last year. I disagree. I disagree with the fact that it could get worse. I don't think it can. I think he's in a much better situation in Green Bay, a much better football situation in Green Bay. I still don't agree with the ADP, but there is a chance for Josh Jacobs to see a relevant role in the passing game. There is an opportunity for him to, sniff 7-8 touchdowns in this offense, despite potentially losing work to Marshawn Lloyd. A few carries here and there. AJ Dillon's still on the team, isn't he? He should be cut though before the season.
Yeah, there was like zero guarantee money with his deal.
Yeah, he I wouldn't surprise me if he gets cut before the season. But if he's still around, he'll take 25, 30 touches probably this year as well. But I think we're going to get a healthy dose of Marshawn Lloyd. And so when we're talking about him at his ADP price, like I've already explained in 2 videos that I'm not in on him at his current ADP, but I do not think it gets worse for him this year. Therefore, I do think he will be ending his trend of last year, this stumble after fantasy glory in 2022. I do think because he's in a better situation in Green Bay, like this team, I think you were onto something too, Ty, about the rushing touchdowns. Jordan Love was 5th in red zone pass attempts last year. This team will throw around the goal line. They've got Romeo Doubs. They've got Christian Watson. They'll run end arounds with Jaden Reed in the red zone as well. Like this team will get creative with the football. It's not a guarantee Josh Jacobs, sees these high value touches that we want out of running backs, but he'll buck that trend and still be a fantasy relevant, top 15 running back this year. But that doesn't mean I have to like him at ADP either. Let's move on to a position we haven't talked about yet, Ty. David Njoku, tight end for the Cleveland Browns. Look, he finally had his breakout season last year. He had kind of been this post-hype sleeper going into the season. Everybody thought it could be, in 2022 with Deshaun Watson coming back, this offense taking a step forward in the passing game. But it was last year where he had 81 receptions, 882 yards, and 6 touchdowns, where he was the tight end 6 in PPR formats. Now, the case for him trending is that we really started to see Njoku pop from week 7 on last year. He was seeing 9 targets per game, which was the most in the league during that stretch. He was 2nd in receiving yards during that stretch and was the overall tight end 1 from week 7 through week 18 last year. Now, the problem is, though, Deshaun Watson only played 5 games last year. And in those 5 games with Deshaun Watson, he only averaged 8.3 fantasy points per game. So what say you? Will David Njoku continue trending on his breakout season in 2024, or will he be taking a tumble down instead?
This one's tough because this is a player that had a very prominent role in this Cleveland offense last year. But I don't necessarily think that we can take what happened last year and make I don't want to say confident prediction, but we can't really say that anything will be the same as compared to last year, because you only got 7 games out of Deshaun Watson. And then you kind of went between Dorian Thompson-Robinson and PJ Walker, and then Joe Flacco just kind of came out of nowhere, right?
I can't remember where I saw it. Basically, Canadian football. Oh, Hayden Wink, Silver Underdog. Yeah, basically Canadian Football League quarterback play for about 3 weeks.
Seriously. And then you had, Amari Cooper was really the only other notable target getter. Like, yeah, you had Elijah Moore, but I mean, we are now kind of realizing that Elijah Moore is a nice little like number 3 option in terms of wide receivers, at least. Then the team went out and got Jerry Jeudy. And I think in the way, like, I feel very similarly to how I felt about Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary last year, where people were like, oh, it's Devin Singletary. This is still Dameon Pierce's backfield and all this stuff. It's like, no, like Devin Singletary is better than you think, is highly rated or rated highly more than you would think a coach should rate him. I get that same vibe with Jerry Jeudy. I think teams are kind of fascinated by the fact that this was a pretty well-known wide receiver coming out of Alabama, first round draft capital. Seeing how things played out in Denver, I think Jerry Jeudy was one of those players that teams were okay to take a shot on, right? Cleveland did. They signed him to a weird extension, but putting the money aside, you now have Amari Cooper, you now have Jerry Jeudy, you now have Elijah Moore. There's even more competition now for this football with a Deshaun Watson that has not exactly returned to form that we remember in 2020, 2021. So I want to say that what we were seeing last year, that trend that he was on, getting 6 receptions a game, 8, 9 targets a game, I think it's coming to an end.
Yeah, and the community is saying that as well. Again, he's being drafted as a tight end 10. If we were expecting him to continue this trend, you'd see him going ahead of debatably a George Kittle, a Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram for sure. You'd see him going ahead of, even though Evan Ingram had a nice season last year. I don't think we're going to continue to see this trend. Deshaun Watson, hasn't been the worst for fantasy tight ends, but when we were all expecting the breakout in 2022 and it never came, granted, Deshaun Watson looked like he hadn't played football in, 2.5 years he was out of the league. And it looked like he hadn't played in the league for 1.5 years. So we expect that to be last year, but then it came with Joe Flacco, who was literally just chucking the ball around the yard. It was two-hand touch football at recess for him last year, where it was grip it and rip it. I don't, there's no logical explanation for this other than, there's more mouths to feed. Do I really like Jerry Jeudy enough where I think it siphons away from Njoku enough? Like, yes and no. Like, I think he'll be a relevant piece, but it's not like, he's going to siphon 3 targets per game away from David Njoku. This is mostly me saying, like, I just don't think Deshaun Watson and David Njoku are, this lightning in a bottle pair like Joe Flacco and David Njoku were at the end of last season. So as much as I like David Njoku, the player, as much as I would love to see him thrive again in 2024, I just don't think the situation sets up well for it. And again, his ADP in the community agrees with that, where he's going as a tight end 10, after Evan Ingram, after Jake Ferguson, after George Kittle. It's nothing against him. I think he's still fine at the tight end 10. Like that's where I bet he finishes this year. But that unfortunately just means he's ending and he won't continue that, elite tier tight end trend going into this year. Speaking of elite tiers, Dak Prescott put himself in that tier fantasy wise at the end of last season. Look, he was the quarterback 3 overall, 4th in passing attempts, 3rd in yards, and 1st in overall completions last year. He was at a very nice 69 completion percentage last year. So the trending case for Dak Prescott is that, look, he was a quarterback 1 overall, from week 6 on last year. Yes, he scored more fantasy points than Josh Allen from week 6 on last year. And they did nothing to this running back room to make it any better. Basically, all signs point towards put the ball in Dak's hands, let him truck it around the yard. Let's see if we can make magic happen 2 years in a row. The situation is set up for it, right? That's the case for Dak Prescott continuing to be a trending player this year. Unfortunately, though, you look at the first 5 weeks of last year, he was the quarterback 21. And really, he had a cushy schedule during that week 7 on stretch last year. It was a lot of teams who were weak against the pass, or it was a lot of shootout games with other good offenses as well. So it was an easy spot for Dak to bounce back, play a bunch of cushy defenses, or be in high scoring affairs where he was forced to throw the football. But what say you, Ty? Will Dak Prescott continue trending? I'll even give him the benefit of the doubt and say a top 5 quarterback in 2024, or will he be ending and kind of fall back to the reality and the expectation, which was, right between the quarterback, 8 to 12 for him last year?
What it really comes down to is, we know that Dak over the last 5 years, 2 seasons, he has not played a full season. In 2020, he only played 5 games. In 2022, he only played in 12 games. When he is healthy, he is consistently a 4,500 yard passer. He puts up a ton of yards. The question is always touchdowns. I really even I shouldn't phrase it as question, but that's what it comes down to, touchdowns. And his yearly touchdown count, 2016, 23, 2017, 22. Then he went 22, 30, 9 in 2020 in just 5 games, 37, 23, and 36. If Dak Prescott can go for more than 32 touchdowns, then what we saw last year can continue. And I would say that it's a trend. I lean towards what we saw last year continuing. I'll say it like that.
Sure.
But I do want to express some level of concern that, because last year was, again, 36 touchdowns, just 9 interceptions, 4,500 passing yards, a career high in completion percentage.
Yeah.
It would not shock me if he regresses a little bit, but him regressing a little bit still puts him in this probably quarterback 8 to 11 range. And that's certainly valuable. And that's kind of where he's going to go in drafts this year again, because no one really knows where to put Dak Prescott. You can't put him too high, but you can't put him too low. So I lean towards what we saw last year continuing. So I'll lean towards trending, but I don't think it's a slam dunk that it's going to continue again.
Yeah, if I talked about Kyren Williams as the ending light, Dak Prescott is a virgin pina colada, right? Or it's it's still going to be really, really good. It's still going to be really, really good. But you know what? It would be just a bit better if you put some rum in there, right? That would be the chef's kiss on top of it, right? But if you're not of age, you're going to get a virgin pina colada. I'm sorry. But that's what Dak Prescott feels like to me this year, right? Where the system is set up for him to chuck the ball around the yard again, for him again to be top 5, in attempts, to potentially be top 3 in yards again. The situation is set up for it. The big thing that worries me, though, is that are they going to be able to set up the run game to make that happen? Because at least last year, despite how bad you think Tony Pollard was, at least he was always a threat on the ground, and NFL teams knew that, right? Now you bring in kind of the ghost of Zeke, the skeletons in the closet from the Dallas Cowboys of Ezekiel, Elliott, right? You kind of bring that back, and Rico Dowdle's a nice little player, but I yesterday I was on stream with Ron Stewart, and I'm part of me is is Rico Dowdle just super Walmart Tony Pollard, of 2 years ago? But the system is there for Dak to throw, despite what Mike McCarthy said last offseason of, we want to run the football more. What did they do? They threw, and dang it, they threw some more. I think you're onto it, though. I think the touchdown to interception ratio is going to level out a bit more this year. I have Dak throwing for 31 touchdowns, 12 picks this year. I think you see those increase. And then you look at other guys too, right? Like Joe Burrow, Anthony Richardson of last year, right? Guys who didn't even play the full season. CJ Stroud, who we expect to take a step forward this year. Right there, you're looking at 3 guys who I have ranked ahead of him. Now, if Dak Prescott finished ahead of CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow, I certainly wouldn't be surprised. But, you throw more variance into the quarterback position here. So while, again, I'm with you, I think Dak Prescott has everything within his control to repeat a phenomenal season, a top 5 worthy season. Kyler Murray was another name. I don't think I mentioned that I have ahead of Dak Prescott as well, who we will have for a full season this year. But Does that mean he will finish there? No. And I think there's just enough regression coming where he will be more on the ending side than the trending side this year. But I still think he'll turn in a perfectly fine fantasy season. I am with you there. Let's wrap it out, Ty. We got one more player to talk about, and this is an interesting one. When you brought up this player, I knew we had to talk about him because this is a fascinating player. It's a player that I have been in love with over the last 2 years. Last year, for sure, I was talking about him left and right at every opportunity I could, and it's James Conner, running back for the Arizona Cardinals. Look, in 13 games last year, 208 attempts for over 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. It's pretty dang good. He caught 27 passes as well, 165 yards, 2 touchdowns. He was the running back 13 in fantasy points per game last year. And from weeks 13 to 18 to wrap out the season, he gave you a league-winning stretch. He was the running back 2 overall, and the running back 1 in fantasy points per game with 23.9. Here's the problem, though, with James Conner. Number one, we all know he can't stay healthy. But he didn't stay healthy last year. But the team went out and drafted Trey Benson with pick 66 in the early third round of the NFL draft. Right? They finally bring in some worthy competition for James Conner. But does that impact him immediately in the 2024 season? Contract year, last year of James Conner's contract. So will James Conner capitalize on his overall running back 2 finish at the end of last year, Ty, or will he take a tumble downwards this year? I feel like I've been saying take a tumble a lot this episode, but when these guys finish so high, that's kind of the only way to describe it. And maybe I'll start this one. When I say I think James Conner is going to continue trending this year, I am talking much more about his running back 13 in fantasy points per game than I am, his week 13 to 18 stretch last year when he was the running back 2. Because for me, there's not a world where James Conner finishes as a top 5, top 10, top 12 running back. This may be a top 12. There's a world where that happens. But there's not a world where I see James Conner finishing in this upper echelon elite tier of running backs this year. I do think he continues trending, though, because I do think the Arizona Cardinals are just going to burn the tires off of him. And as much as we like Trey Benson, it wouldn't surprise me if they just keep him in the wings to learn from James Conner. I know it's not a quarterback situation, but I'll at least throw those thoughts out there that I think James Conner is trending, but it's more so on his running back 13 in fantasy points per game last year. What about you? How do you think this backfield plays out?
I think the intrigue for James Conner in years past has been, that he's capable of getting 20 plus carries every now and then in a single game. I don't know if that'll happen this year. I don't know if there's going to be a game where James Conner gets more than 20 carries. He can maybe get 20 touches in a game, right? You get the one-off game where he gets like 4 receptions and he's got 18 carries. Like, you may get one of those. We do have to just acknowledge the fact that he is 29 years old and that he did take advantage of having quite literally no one else in this backfield for the past 2 years. And yes, you brought up Trey Benson. Maybe Trey Benson doesn't immediately pose that much of a threat to him. But I guarantee you, Trey Benson, and I will say this, maybe, do we think Arizona can make the playoffs?
No, not in their division.
That just increases the possibility for Trey Benson to just begin to take over the backfield towards the end of the season. Now, you can capitalize on the first 8 weeks of the season, the first 9 weeks of the season, where James Conner could be the lead back. I just think last year was kind of the last year that we saw where you were going to get some spike weeks from James Conner. You may get one of them, may get 2 of them this year. Maybe the best way to say it is this. This team did not have a fully healthy Kyler Murray, did not have a Marvin Harrison Jr. last year. Now they've got both. And that just you have to account for that in some way. And I know last year, you kind of briefly mentioned it. The intrigue for James Conner was the fact that it's like, no one cares that this backfield is his and he's still going outside the top 25. Yes, we knew Arizona's offense was not going to be like super high scoring, but it's like, we just don't care that a running back one is just going way late in like 8, 9 rounds, right? So I think the situation's a little bit different. I don't think what we saw last year continues. We may see some good weeks out of him, but he is not the sneaky running back 2 that you can kind of wait for in drafts this year. He is a depth piece this year, and he may be a bye week fill in kind of player. I just struggled to really put any kind of, it's hard to trust James Conner this year, I think is the best way to say it.
So I'll retort with this. Is there a world where, sure, James Conner doesn't see 20 touches a game, doesn't see 20 rushing opportunities per game, which, I mean, I think is a valid point, because at the end of last season, and from, weeks 13 to 18, he had 25 plus rushing attempts in three of those 5 games, over 100 rushing yards in those games as well. How many touchdowns did he score? 2. Yeah, he scored 4 touchdowns in those 3 games. So, obviously, those touches help with that. Is there a world, though, where James Conner still sees like 14 rushing attempts per game, but Trey Benson shoulders the load and takes 6, 7 per game to keep James Conner's legs underneath him? Is there a world where that happens?
Yeah, I think so.
So I think there's a world where we can keep James Conner fresh throughout the season. I mean, James Conner was averaging, 5 yards a carry last year, which, looking at his career stats is, up from years past where, where he was averaging 3.7, 4.3, 4.34, right? Like, the efficiency numbers are what I'm encouraged by, because now when you get Kyler Murray back to, you add a viable passing threat, you also add a viable rushing threat from Kyler Murray as well. And you can say, well, he's going to take away rushing attempts from James Conner. I mean, that isn't necessarily what we saw at the end of last season. We still saw James Conner get plenty of usage, but instead of giving James Conner the ball, 25, 26, 27 times, maybe we see something more like in week 15 and 16 against the 49ers and the Bears, where James Conner only gets, 14 rush attempts, but he's still targeted 4 or 5 times through the air, when Kyler Murray was back from week 10 on. And he saw 0 targets the first week back, but then he saw 3, 5, 2, 3, 5, 1, 4 targets, which are all healthy target numbers. And I don't know if Trey Benson is going to come in and just be like, nope, I am taking 4 targets a game. I don't think that happens. I still think James Conner is the one. Trey Benson is a nice complementary 2-piece, but then it's like, sorry, James Conner, see you bye. We got as much credit as we could. Trey Benson's our guy moving forward. I just think there's a world where it's a 1A, 1B, and James Conner can still finish as a top 20 running back, on efficiency and touchdowns, despite, Kyler Murray being a threat around the goal line too. This one, okay, I know I said trending at the beginning of this segment. You said Josh Jacobs was about as middle of a line that you could run in terms of trending or ending. To me, that's James Conner. I feel like he's about as middle of a line in terms of trending or ending for me, because I do think he can still turn in a fantasy relevant season, but it's definitely not going to. I don't know if he finishes, running back 13 in fantasy points per game this year. I do think it can be top 20 though.
Yeah, I mean, I've got him currently based on my rankings in our draft guide that you should absolutely check out. What James Conner is my running back 19, and I'm just kind of calculating per game what that would come out to. Let's see, 17. It's about 12.3. So it's not, and that's again based on a fully healthy season.
Yeah.
So going from what he had last year at 15.5 in 13 games to about 12 and a half, 3 fantasy points. That's a 3 fantasy point per game difference. That's kind of steep, I will admit. But I think that is what I think that's the difference that a fully healthy Kyler Murray, a Marvin Harrison Jr., and a Trey Benson in this offense can present to James Conner.
And a full season of Trey McBride too. Let's also throw that in there. I know you're not as pro Trey McBride as some of us on the podcast, but
We had a full season of Rondale Moore, and that didn't really matter. So
Rondale Moore, my goat, baby.
Jersey list. He's
how hasn't he made the jersey list?
I was gonna say
this is a shame. This is the shame he hasn't made my jersey list yet.
Jamal Agnew has been on the jersey list for such a long time, and now
shout out Jamal Agnew. Did not deserve to get cut by the Jaguars. What a crime. No more Calvin Ridley. That was Jamal Agnew's time to shine, yet they cut him. What a disgrace the Jacksonville Jaguars are as a franchise, despite I really liking the moves they made this offseason. But come on, Jamal Agnew, future wide receiver one.
Yeah, the man that now has no job, you need to find a replacement for on the jersey list. And I think Rondale Moore presents a very, very good candidate for that. Want a Rondale?
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for tuning in before we go too much further off the rails. Anything you want to add before we sign off, Ty?
Hey, check out our draft guide. Seriously, you get all three of our rankings. We stat project over 250 players each.
So that's over 750 projections. Keep going. So
you not only get to see like our own personal rankings, you get the consensus. And if you really want to, you can just follow like my rankings, because you guys know that I'm always right. Then Lucas is probably. You just absolutely should not follow Cam's, because Lord knows having Deontay Johnson as a top 24 wide receiver is just absurd.
I want whatever that man was having when he was creating his rankings with Deontay Johnson. My goodness. No, but for real, draft guide is out. $10 if you want to go, fellasdraftguide.com. Or if you sign up with our code fellas over on Underdog Fantasy, they will give you a free square in their pick'em lobby and up to $250 in bonus cash through first time deposit as well. Upon your first deposit, we will send you our draft guide for 100% free then. So again, promo code fellas over on Underdog if you want to get in on their contests, give you a free pick'em square and up to $250 in bonus cash. Or you can just go to fellasdraftguide.com and pay $10 over there for it. And we'll be bringing out more tools for our draft guide. Right now, it's just our projections, but we will be bringing out a full video archive as well. We will be bringing risk and upside scores as well. And what is the other one I'm missing, Ty? Tiered rankings. I feel like there's another big one I'm missing in there. There's another update. Now I can't remember what it is.
I can't remember either. Uh-oh. That's not a good look.
That's not a good look. We got updates coming, though, outside of just our ranking, so make sure you stay tuned for those. But I think the biggest ones you're going to benefit from are the video archive, where if there's a piece of content created on a player, whether it was in a podcast, a YouTube video, or a short, it will be in the archive for you if you missed that video. I think that is one of the biggest benefits of the draft guide is, a lot of draft guides will give you player profiles, to give you like the minute clips, that people are like highlighting. They give you like we averaged this last year. And if this happens, it's like the classic, like, how far will this team go in March Madness? Like the Joe Lombardi, right? Or not Joe Lombardi.
Joe Lunardi.
Joe Lunardi, thank you. I'm like, Lombardi is not correct. Joe Lunardi. It's the videos that he makes. Oh, this team could go far. No, we are going to just clip every piece of content that we create and put it in the archive for you. So that and much more coming to the draft guide. $10, fellasdraftguide.com, or code fellas over on Underdog Fantasy. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy. We have more content coming out for you in future weeks, so make sure you're subscribed. Turn on that notification bell so you know when all of our newest episodes are up. We will be back next week with even more content for you all. Deuces.